Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving straight into a really provocative parenting philosophy today. Think about it. What do you do when your kid just won't cooperate? Well, our source material has a very clear and honestly pretty challenging answer.
So let's kick things off with a question that, so many parents grapple with. Your child is stubborn, totally unmotivated. What's the playbook? Do you sit down and try to reason with them, or does real effective parenting actually demand a different kind of authority?
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at how the source defines the problem. Then, we'll get into this idea of parental power. After that, we'll explore the so-called rules of the system, how you'd actually use them, and wrap up with what might be the most important part of this whole thing, the parent's mindset.
Okay, so the source material doesn't pull any punches. It starts right away by framing the issue with a specific Korean term, goltung. And believe me, this word really sets the tone for everything that follows.
Now, according to this philosophy, a goltung it's not a person you sit down and consult with like a peer. The term frames the situation as a problem to be handled, something the adult needs to manage with a whole lot of wisdom and strategy.
Okay, so if we're talking about a problem that needs to be solved, what are the tools for the job? This question leads us right to the heart of this philosophy, the power that parents inherently have. The source argues that parents are given some pretty powerful tools. In fact, it uses the provocative word weapons. But let's be super clear here. We're not talking about punishment. The idea is that these are tools specifically for wise guidance.
And these aren't just vague ideas. No, the source is talking about very real, tangible things. We're talking about control over the money, ownership of the home, and the authority that just naturally comes from being the provider.
And this leads to a really key concept, stewardship. The thinking here is that these resources, the house, the money, they don't really belong to the parent. They're actually entrusted to the parent for the child's sake. They're tools that are meant to be used actively to guide them.
From here, things get a little more cosmic. The philosophy builds this idea into a kind of metaphysical system. The source actually calls it heaven's rule, and it connects all this parental power to what it sees as a higher natural law.
So the idea is that there's this natural law at play. Some higher power, whether you call it heaven or great nature, wants to support people who are studying. And how does it do that? Well, it funnels the resources they need directly through their parents.
This whole concept basically creates two very different phases of life. You've got the student phase, where support is flowing to you through your family, but the moment you switch to the working person phase, you start earning your own money, that flow gets cut off, and you've got to provide for yourself. And get this. This isn't just about high school or college. The source says this period of heavenly support can actually go well into your 30s. But there's a big catch. Your focus has to be on genuine, dedicated studying and personal growth. It can't just be an excuse to avoid getting a job.
Okay, so we've got the philosophy down. But how does this work in the real world? Let's take a classic example from the source. You've got a kid who does absolutely nothing but play video games all day.
The source lays out a pretty strategic 5-step plan. Step 1, you engage with them on their level, connect with their interest. Step 2, you state the problem and remind them of your authority over the resource, in this case, the PC. Step 3, you make a clear, conditional deal. 4, you slowly adjust the terms. And the crucial final step, 5, you have to know when it's time to get rid of the deal altogether. And this is super important. The source makes it really clear that this is not about creating a long-term bribe. These deals are just temporary tools. The goal is to shift their whole way of thinking, not to create a system where they only do things if they get something in return. All right, this brings us to what the source says is the most important part of this entire philosophy. It's not just about having the tools, it's all about the mindset of the parent who's supposed to be using them. Because at the end of the day, having these so-called weapons, the money, the authority, is totally useless if the parent doesn't have the wisdom to wield them effectively. The source calls this a high-level paradigm, which is really just the ability to use that power for your child's best interest in the long run. And the source makes a really bold claim here. It says that a parent with a low-level mindset simply cannot raise a successful child. It doesn't matter how much money or power they have. And that totally flips the script, right? It makes the parent's own personal growth the #1 priority. And that's really the final takeaway. This philosophy isn't just a list of parenting hacks. It's a fundamental challenge to parents to look in the mirror and evaluate their own level of wisdom first. It shifts the focus from how do I fix my child to am I equipped to lead, which leaves us with a pretty heavy question to think about.